Marcus stood in the rain, staring at the charred remains of what had once been the Grand Meridian Theater. The building looked like a skeleton against the gray Seattle sky, its blackened bones reaching toward heaven in silent accusation. Water dripped from the twisted metal framework where ornate balconies had once welcomed theatergoers in evening gowns and tailored suits. Now, weeds pushed through cracks in the foundation, and graffiti marked the lower walls like scars. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His 8-year-old daughter Emma tugged at his jacket sleeve, her small voice barely audible over the steady patter of rain. "Daddy, is this really ours now?" Marcus pulled his worn baseball cap lower over his eyes, shielding them from the drizzle that seemed to seep into everything in this city. He looked down at the legal papers in his hand, the ink slightly smeared from the moisture, and nodded slowly. "Yeah, sweetheart. Grandpa Joe left it to us." Emma wrinkled her nose as she surveyed the destruction. "It smells funny." The smell was indeed overwhelming, a mixture of charred wood, damp concrete, and something else Marcus couldn't quite identify, something old and forgotten. He'd been a construction worker his entire adult life, had torn down plenty of buildings, but this place felt different. Heavier somehow. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus had been struggling to make ends meet in his cramped apartment across town, working double shifts to keep up with Emma's medical bills. She'd been born with a rare blood disorder that required monthly treatments, each one costing more than he made in 2 weeks of laying drywall and hanging fixtures. His ex-wife Sarah had walked out when Emma was just 2 years old, claiming she couldn't handle the stress of a sick child and a husband who was never home because he was always working to pay for that child's care. The inheritance had come as a complete shock. Marcus barely remembered his grandfather Joseph, a man who had disappeared from family gatherings when Marcus was still in elementary school. All he knew were fragments of stories, that Joseph had once been involved in the arts somehow, that he'd had money and lost it, that he'd become something of a recluse in his later years. The lawyer's call had been surreal. "Mr. Chen, I'm calling regarding your grandfather Joseph Chen's estate. I'm afraid he passed away last month, and according to his will, he's left you his property on Pine Street." Marcus had almost laughed. "I think there's been a mistake. My grandfather didn't have any property. He lived in a nursing home." "No mistake, sir. The Grand Meridian Theater. It's been in probate for 6 months while we located you. I have to warn you, though, the building was severely damaged in a fire 18 months ago. The insurance claim was complicated. Your grandfather had let the policy lapse." Standing there now with Emma beside him, Marcus wondered if this inheritance was a gift or a curse. The property taxes alone would bankrupt him, and the cost of demolition would probably require him to sell the land to a developer just to break even. He'd already received 3 calls from companies wanting to buy the lot, each offering what seemed like generous sums, until he factored in what he owed in back taxes and legal fees. Emma had wandered closer to the building's entrance, where yellow caution tape fluttered in the breeze like prayer flags. "Daddy, look! There's a door that's not burned." Marcus followed her gaze and saw she was right. Tucked around the side of the building, partially hidden by overgrown blackberry bushes, was a metal door that appeared to have survived the fire relatively intact. The paint was blistered and the handle was corroded, but it was still there. "Stay back, Em." It might not be safe, but his daughter had inherited more than just his dark hair and stubborn chin. She'd also gotten his curiosity. She was already pushing through the brambles, her jeans catching on thorns. "It's got numbers on it, Daddy. Like a secret code." Marcus sighed and followed her, careful to test each step on the uncertain ground. The door did indeed have numbers. 4729, painted in faded gold beneath layers of soot and grime. There was something familiar about the combination, though he couldn't place what it was. Probably just an old address number or something, he said, more to himself than to Emma. But as he spoke, he found himself reaching for the handle, brushing away debris to get a better look at the lock mechanism. The door opened with surprising ease, as if it had been waiting for them. Beyond it lay not the burned-out shell Marcus had expected, but a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and dry, carrying with it the faint scent of old wood and something else something that reminded him of his childhood visits to the art museum with his elementary school class. "Daddy, it's like a secret passage!" Emma's eyes were wide with excitement, her earlier disappointment forgotten. Marcus fumbled for his phone's flashlight, the weak beam revealing stone steps worn smooth by decades of use. This must be some kind of basement or storage area. The fire probably didn't reach down here. They descended carefully, Marcus keeping one hand on Emma's shoulder and the other holding his phone high to illuminate their path. The staircase was longer than he'd expected, curving gently to the left as it went down. The walls were lined with faded photographs, headshots of actors and actresses from what looked like the 1940s and 50s, their faces gazing out with the confident glamour of a bygone era. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a surprisingly large underground chamber. Marcus's phone light swept across the space, revealing what appeared to be a forgotten storage room filled with covered shapes, furniture draped in white sheets, tall objects leaning against the walls, and dozens of wooden crates stacked in neat rows. "It's like a treasure room," Emma whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the space. Marcus felt along the wall until he found an old-fashioned light switch. To his surprise, when he flipped it, a series of bare bulbs flickered to life, casting warm yellow light throughout the chamber. Someone had been paying the electric bill, apparently. Or maybe the power was still connected to the building above. With proper lighting, the space revealed itself to be even more extensive than he'd imagined. It was clearly some kind of storage area for the theater, filled with props, costumes, and set pieces from countless productions. But there was something else here too, something that made Marcus's pulse quicken with a mixture of hope and disbelief. Along the far wall, barely visible beneath layers of dust and protective covering, were what appeared to be paintings. Large paintings in ornate frames, stacked 3 and 4 deep against the stone wall like oversized books on a shelf. Emma had already wandered over to investigate a rack of sequined costumes, running her small fingers over the faded fabrics with reverence. "These are so pretty, Daddy. Were they for princesses? Something like that, sweetheart?" Marcus's attention was fixed on those paintings. There was something about the way they were stored, carefully wrapped, precisely arranged, that suggested they were more than just theater decorations. He approached the first covered canvas with the kind of careful respect his construction work had taught him to show potentially dangerous structures. The protective sheet was heavy canvas, secured with what looked like museum-quality ties. As he worked to unfasten them, his hands began to tremble slightly. The first painting he uncovered made him take an involuntary step backward. Even in the dim basement lighting, even through the layer of dust that had accumulated despite the protective covering, he could see that this was something extraordinary. The canvas showed a woman in blue, her face turned slightly away from the viewer, her hands folded in her lap in a gesture that seemed to contain entire worlds of sorrow and hope. Marcus had never been particularly interested in art, but he'd grown up in Seattle, had taken Emma to the art museum on free Sundays when money was especially tight. He recognized quality when he saw it, and this painting radiated a kind of presence that made the basement storage room feel suddenly sacred. With growing excitement and disbelief, he moved to the next covered canvas, then the next. Each painting he revealed was more breathtaking than the last. Portraits, landscapes, abstract works that seemed to dance with their own inner light, all of them bearing the unmistakable marks of master artists. Emma had abandoned the costumes and come to stand beside him, her young eyes wide with wonder. "They're so beautiful, Daddy. Who made them?" Marcus knelt down to examine a small placard attached to one of the frames. The writing was faded but still legible. "Property of J. Chen, acquired 1962. Below that, in smaller text, was a name that made Marcus's heart skip a beat: Henri Matisse. His grandfather's name was on these paintings. His grandfather, who had supposedly been broke, who had lived in a nursing home on Medicaid, who had left behind nothing but a burned-out theater and a pile of unpaid bills. Marcus moved frantically from painting to painting now, checking each placard, each signature, each small detail that might tell him what he was looking at. Picasso, Monet, Van Gogh, names that even someone like him, someone who had never set foot in an art history class, recognized as belonging to the most valuable artists in human history. There were dozens of them. Some were small, intimate pieces that could fit in his arms. Others were massive canvases that would require multiple people to move safely. All of them were protected, preserved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Waiting in this underground chamber like sleeping treasures, Emma tugged at his sleeve again, but this time her voice carried a note of concern. "Daddy, you look funny. Are you sick?" Marcus realized he was breathing too fast, that his vision was starting to blur around the edges. He sat down heavily on a nearby crate, pulling Emma close to him. "I'm okay, sweetheart. I'm just surprised." The implications of what he was seeing began to crash over him in waves. These paintings, if they were authentic, and something deep in his gut told him they were, represented more money than he could ever have imagined possessing. Enough money to pay for Emma's medical treatments for the rest of her life. Enough money to buy a real house with a yard where she could play safely. Enough money to ensure she could go to any college she wanted, could pursue any dream that captured her imagination. But even as these thoughts raced through his mind, other questions began to surface. How had his grandfather acquired these paintings? Why had he kept them hidden? And perhaps most importantly, were they legally his to claim? Marcus pulled out his phone, realizing he needed to document what they'd found. As he began taking pictures, he noticed something else that made his hands shake even more violently. In the corner of the storage room, partially hidden behind a stack of crates, was an old safe. Its door stood slightly ajar, and inside he could see the edge of what appeared to be a leather portfolio. Emma followed his gaze. "What's in there, Daddy?" "I don't know yet, sweetheart, but I think we're about to find out." The portfolio contained documents that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about his grandfather and about himself. Bills of sale, authenticity certificates, insurance appraisals, and a leather-bound journal filled with his grandfather's careful handwriting. As Marcus read, the story began to emerge. Joseph Chen hadn't been a recluse by choice. He'd been in hiding. The journal entries, dating back to the 1960s, told the story of a young man who had come to Seattle with dreams of opening his own art gallery. Joseph had been passionate about art, knowledgeable about artists, and blessed with an eye for talent that bordered on supernatural. He'd managed to acquire pieces from unknown artists who later became legends, had bought works from estates before their true value was recognized, had made connections with collectors who needed discreet sales during difficult financial times. By the 1970s, according to the journal, Joseph had assembled one of the most significant private art collections on the West Coast. The Grand Meridian Theater had been both his gallery and his home, its elegant spaces perfectly suited for displaying the treasures he'd spent years acquiring. But then, something had gone wrong. The journal entries from the late 1970s became increasingly paranoid, filled with references to, quote, investigators, and, quote, questions about provenance, and people who don't understand the difference between collecting and stealing. Marcus pieced together what must have happened. His grandfather had become caught up in an investigation into stolen artwork, pieces that had been looted during World War II, paintings that had been sold under duress, works whose ownership had become legally murky in the chaos of wartime Europe. Whether Joseph had knowingly purchased stolen art or had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, Marcus couldn't tell from the journal entries. But it was clear that his grandfather had felt threatened enough to close his gallery, dismiss his staff, and retreat from public life entirely. The final entries in the journal, dated just 3 years earlier, revealed Joseph's plan. He would hide the collection in the theater's basement, make it appear that he'd lost everything, and wait for the legal climate to change. The fire, according to a newspaper clipping tucked into the journal's back pages, had been ruled accidental, faulty wiring in the building's aging electrical system. But Marcus suspected his grandfather might have seen it as a gift, a way to make the world believe that his treasures had been destroyed, along with everything else. Emma had grown bored with the documents and was exploring other parts of the basement, her voice echoing as she narrated her discoveries to herself. "Here's a box of pretty jewelry, and here's a trunk full of fancy clothes. Oh, and here's another room." Marcus looked up sharply. "Another room? Emma, stay where I can see you." But she had already disappeared around a corner he hadn't noticed before. He quickly gathered up the most important documents and followed her voice through what turned out to be a narrow passage between two walls. The second chamber was smaller than the first, but even more carefully organized. This appeared to be where his grandfather had stored his most precious pieces. The paintings here were individually wrapped and stored in climate-controlled cases, each one labeled with meticulous care. There were sculptures, too, small bronze figures and marble pieces that seemed to glow with their own inner light. Emma was standing in front of a glass case that contained what appeared to be jewelry, but as Marcus approached, he realized these weren't just pretty baubles. These were museum-quality pieces, Art Nouveau brooches, Art Deco necklaces, and rings that looked like they belonged in royal collections. "Daddy, there's a letter with my name on it." Marcus followed her pointing finger and saw it immediately. A sealed envelope leaning against the glass case with Emma written across it in his grandfather's careful handwriting. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a brief note and a small key. "My dear great-granddaughter," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the time has come for you to inherit not just my mistakes, but my hopes for redemption. The key opens a deposit box at Seattle First National, Box 1847. Inside, you will find the legal documents that prove these pieces were acquired legitimately, as well as my plans for ensuring they serve a greater purpose than mere wealth." The letter continued, "I have spent 30 years in exile, hiding from accusations I could never fully answer. But I want you to know that every piece in this collection was purchased legally, with proper documentation, from sellers who had clear title. The authorities were never interested in evidence that contradicted their assumptions. They wanted a scapegoat, and I was convenient." Marcus felt his throat tighten as he read the final paragraph. "I have watched your father struggle to provide for you, watched him sacrifice his own dreams to ensure you receive the medical care you need. This collection is my gift to both of you, but more than that, it is my hope that you will use it to help other families who find themselves in similar circumstances." The Grand Meridian was once a place where art brought joy to thousands of people. Perhaps it can be again. Emma looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy, are you crying?" Marcus wiped his cheek, surprised to find it wet. "Just a little, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups cry when they're happy. Are we rich now?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Marcus was only beginning to understand. "I think we might be, Em. But more importantly, I think we have a chance to help a lot of people." As they made their way back through the basement chambers, Marcus's mind raced with possibilities. The authentication and legal processes would take months, maybe years. There would be questions about provenance, investigations into his grandfather's claims of legitimate ownership, and probably media attention that would make their lives complicated in ways he couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time since Emma's diagnosis, for the first time since Sarah had walked out, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus felt something that had been absent from his life for years: hope. They climbed the stone steps slowly, Emma chattering excitedly about the princess jewels and the secret paintings, while Marcus mentally cataloged everything they would need to do. Lawyers, appraisers, insurance companies, security firms. The list seemed endless. But underlying all the practical concerns was a growing sense of purpose that surprised him with its intensity. His grandfather's letter had mentioned using the collection to help other families, and Marcus found himself thinking about all the other parents he'd met in hospital waiting rooms, all the other people working multiple jobs just to keep their heads above water, all the other children who deserved better than the hand they'd been dealt. As they emerged from the basement into the gray Seattle afternoon, the burned theater looked different to Marcus. Instead of seeing only destruction, he began to see possibility. The shell of the building could be restored, could once again become a place where art brought beauty into people's lives. The collection hidden below could fund not just their own future, but programs to help families facing medical crises, scholarships for children who needed second chances, support for single parents trying to do right by their kids. Emma squeezed his hand as they walked back toward their car. "Daddy, when we fix up the theater, can I help pick out which paintings to hang on the walls?" Marcus smiled, feeling something settle into place in his chest. "Absolutely, sweetheart. We'll make it beautiful together." The rain had stopped, and for the first time in months, Marcus noticed that the sun was trying to break through the clouds. As they drove away from the Grand Meridian Theater, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror and was surprised to see that he looked different somehow. Not just hopeful, but determined. Ready? The inheritance his grandfather had left them was more than just valuable art and property. It was a chance to rewrite their story, to transform struggle into purpose, to turn a legacy of hiding into a future of giving. And as Emma hummed contentedly in the back seat, already planning how they would decorate their theater, Marcus allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the best parts of their lives were still ahead of them. The discovery in the basement had taken less than 2 hours, but Marcus knew it would take much longer to understand everything it meant. There would be challenges ahead, legal complications, difficult decisions about which pieces to sell and which to keep, questions about how to honor his grandfather's wishes while building the life he wanted for Emma. But for now, driving through the streets of Seattle with his daughter beside him and the promise of a different future ahead of them, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: the absolute certainty that everything was about to change for the better. The burned theater that had seemed like a burden that morning now felt like the beginning of an adventure. And Marcus Chen, single father, construction worker, and now unlikely heir to a fortune in hidden masterpieces, was ready to see where that adventure would take them. The authentication process began 3 days later in the sterile conference room of Hartwell & Associates, Seattle's most prestigious art valuation firm. Marcus sat across from Dr. Elena Vasquez, a woman in her 50s whose reputation for identifying forgeries was legendary in art circles from New York to London. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, and her dark eyes seemed to see through whatever they examined down to its molecular structure. Emma sat beside him, swinging her legs from the adult-sized chair, occasionally glancing up from her coloring book to watch the serious adults discuss numbers that seemed impossibly large. Marcus had arranged for his neighbor Mrs. Patterson to pick her up after lunch, but Emma had insisted on staying for the morning session. "Mr. Chen," Dr. Vasquez said, adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses as she reviewed the preliminary photographs Marcus had provided, "I must tell you that collections of this scope and apparent quality don't simply appear from nowhere. The art world is smaller than most people realize, and pieces of this caliber have histories that are meticulously tracked." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying that if these works are authentic, and if they were acquired through legitimate channels as your grandfather's documents suggest, then we're looking at one of the most significant private collections to surface in decades. But that's a very big if." She pulled out a magnifying glass and began examining the high-resolution photos more closely. "This Matisse, for instance. The brushwork appears consistent with his blue period style, and the provenance documentation you've provided suggests it was purchased from a private estate sale in 1963. But we'll need to conduct extensive technical analysis, X-ray imaging, and cross-reference it against every known catalog of his work." The next several hours passed in a blur of technical terminology and methodical examination. Dr. Vasquez called in 2 associates, both of whom spoke in hushed, reverent tones, as they reviewed image after image. Marcus found himself studying their faces, searching for any sign of skepticism or suspicion, but saw only growing excitement barely contained beneath professional restraint. "Daddy," Emma whispered during a brief pause in the proceedings, "why does everyone look so serious about the pretty pictures?" Marcus smiled despite his nervousness. "Because these aren't just pretty pictures, sweetheart. They're very special, and we need to make sure they're real." "They looked real to me," Emma said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Dr. Vasquez overheard and smiled for the first time that day. "You know, Mr. Chen, children often have better instincts about authenticity than adults do. We get so caught up in technical analysis that we sometimes forget to simply look and feel." She turned back to her computer screen, where she'd been cross-referencing the documented pieces against various databases. "I have to say, your grandfather's records are remarkably thorough. Every purchase is documented with receipts, bills of sale, and in many cases, letters from the artists or their representatives. This level of documentation is extraordinary." "So you think they're legitimate?" "Preliminary assessments suggest yes, but we'll need weeks of detailed analysis to be certain. However, I can tell you this much. If even half of these pieces prove authentic, you're looking at a collection worth well over $100 million. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd known the paintings were valuable, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly made it seem simultaneously more real and more impossible. Emma looked up from her coloring. "Is $100 million a lot?" Dr. Vasquez laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise her. "Yes, little one, it's quite a lot." After the meeting, Marcus drove Emma to school and then found himself with several hours to kill before his afternoon shift at the construction site. Instead of going home, he drove back to the theater. He needed to see the collection again, to convince himself that the morning's revelations weren't some elaborate dream. The basement chambers felt different in the afternoon light, filtering down through the stairway. More real, somehow. As Marcus moved through the rooms, examining pieces he'd been too overwhelmed to really see during their first visit, he began to understand something about his grandfather that the journal entries hadn't fully conveyed. Joseph Chin hadn't just been a collector. He'd been a curator, someone who understood how pieces worked together to tell larger stories. The way the paintings were arranged, even in storage, suggested careful thought about color, theme, and historical period. It wasn't random accumulation of valuable objects. It was a coherent vision of artistic expression across cultures and centuries. Marcus found himself stopping in front of a small oil painting he'd missed during their first visit. It showed a man working with his hands, his face illuminated by warm light streaming through a window. The signature in the corner was illegible to Marcus, but something about the subject matter made him pause. His phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Vasquez. Preliminary research confirms authenticity of 3 tested pieces. This is going to be significant. We need to discuss security measures immediately. Security? Marcus hadn't even thought about security. He looked around the basement with new eyes, realizing that he was standing in what amounted to an unguarded treasure chamber. Anyone could break in, could discover what he'd found, could steal pieces worth millions of dollars. He made several phone calls from the basement, arranging for a security company to install cameras and motion sensors, for an insurance appraiser to conduct a formal evaluation, for a lawyer who specialized in art law to review his grandfather's documentation. Each conversation seemed to make their situation more real and more complicated. By the time he arrived at the construction site that afternoon, Marcus felt like he was living in 2 different worlds. In one world, he was a man who might be worth over $100 million. In the other, he was still Marcus Chen, construction worker, who needed to finish hanging drywall to make his rent payment. His crew chief, Tony Rodriguez, noticed his distraction immediately. "You okay, Marcus? You look like you've seen a ghost." Marcus almost laughed. "Something like that." "Well, shake it off. We've got a deadline to meet, and the electrical guys need this wall finished before they can start running their lines." For the next 6 hours, Marcus lost himself in the familiar rhythm of physical work. There was something grounding about the weight of the drywall sheets, the precision required to measure and cut, the satisfaction of seeing a rough frame transform into a finished wall. It was honest work, work he understood, work that didn't come with overwhelming questions about authenticity and legal ownership. But even as his hands stayed busy, his mind kept returning to the basement chambers, to his grandfather's journal, to the implications of what they'd discovered. He thought about Emma's medical bills, about the scholarship fund his grandfather had envisioned, about the possibility of rebuilding the theater into something that could serve the community. Around quitting time, Tony approached him again. "You sure you're all right? I've been watching you work today, and it's like you're somewhere else entirely." Marcus set down his tools and considered how much to tell him. Tony had been his supervisor for 3 years, had covered for him when Emma was in the hospital, had even loaned him money when things got particularly tight. If anyone deserved to know what was happening, it was Tony. "I inherited some property from my grandfather," Marcus said carefully. "Yeah? That's good news, right? Maybe you can finally get out of that cramped apartment." "It's complicated." The property came with some unexpected contents. Tony raised an eyebrow. "What kind of contents? Please tell me it's not a house full of cats or something." Despite everything, Marcus smiled. "No cats. Art. Valuable art." "How valuable are we talking about?" Marcus hesitated, then decided that keeping it completely secret was probably impossible anyway. "Maybe very valuable. I'm having it appraised." Tony whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. You find out you're rich, and you still show up to hang drywall. That's either very noble or very stupid. I don't know if I'm rich yet. And even if I am, I'm not sure what that means. It means you don't have to worry about making rent anymore, for starters. The simplicity of Tony's perspective was oddly comforting. Marcus had been so focused on the overwhelming implications of the discovery that he'd lost sight of the most basic fact. If the collection was authentic, Emma's future was secure. Whatever else happened, whatever complications arose, that fundamental anxiety that had governed his life for 8 years could finally be put to rest. That evening, as Marcus helped Emma with her homework at their small kitchen table, she looked up from her math worksheet with a serious expression. "Daddy, are we going to move away from here?" The question caught him off guard. "Why would you think that?" "At school today, Lily said that when people get rich, they move to big houses far away and forget about their old friends." Marcus set down his pencil and gave Emma his full attention. "What do you think about that?" Emma considered this carefully, the way she approached all important questions. "I think I'd miss Mrs. Patterson. And my teacher. And the park where we feed the ducks." "Well, then we won't move far away from those things. Rich or not rich, the people and places we care about are still important." "But we might get a bigger apartment?" Marcus smiled. "We might get a bigger apartment. With my own room?" "Definitely with your own room." Emma returned to her math problems, apparently satisfied with this arrangement. But her questions had highlighted something Marcus hadn't fully considered: how dramatically their lives might change, and how important it would be to manage that change thoughtfully. Over the next several days, Marcus found himself caught between two increasingly demanding schedules. During the day, he continued working construction while dealing with a steady stream of phone calls from appraisers, lawyers, and insurance representatives. In the evenings, he spent hours at the theater, cataloging pieces, organizing his grandfather's documents, and meeting with the various experts who were examining the collection. Dr. Vasquez's initial optimism proved justified. Each authentication test confirmed what the preliminary assessment had suggested. The collection was not only legitimate, but historically significant. The Matisse was genuine. The small Picasso sketch was from the artist's Rose period. The Monet landscape had been purchased directly from the artist's estate in 1964. But perhaps more importantly, the legal documentation was holding up to scrutiny. Every piece had a clear chain of ownership, proper bills of sale, and in many cases letters from the artists or their authorized representatives. Joseph Chen had been meticulous in his record-keeping, perhaps anticipating that questions might one day be raised about his acquisitions. "Your grandfather was either very careful or very lucky," explained Margaret Hoffman, the art law specialist Marcus had retained. "In either case, his documentation is exemplary. I don't see any legal obstacles to your ownership of these pieces." The insurance appraisal, when it finally came, exceeded even Dr. Vasquez's estimates. The total value of the collection was assessed at $123 million, making it one of the most valuable private collections in the Pacific Northwest. Marcus received this news while sitting in his truck outside Emma's school, waiting to pick her up from her after-school program. He stared at the number on his phone screen for a long time, trying to make it feel real. $123 million. More money than he could spend in several lifetimes. Emma climbed into the truck with her usual cheerful energy, chattering about her day as Marcus drove toward home. She'd made a friend named Sarah who also had to take special medicine, and her teacher had read them a story about a dragon who learned to share his treasure with the village. The dragon was sad and lonely when he kept all his gold hidden in his cave, Emma explained. But when he started using it to help people, he made lots of friends and felt happy again. Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "That's a good story. What do you think the dragon learned?" "That treasure is more fun when you share it." The wisdom of 8-year-olds, Marcus reflected, sometimes surpassed that of adults by a considerable margin. That weekend, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of beginning the process of selling pieces from the collection, he decided to start exploring his grandfather's vision of rebuilding the theater. He arranged to meet with Sarah Kim, an architect who specialized in historic renovation, to assess the feasibility of restoring the Grand Meridian. Sarah's enthusiasm for the project was immediate and infectious. "This building has incredible bones," she said as they walked through the damaged structure. "The fire destroyed most of the interior, but the main supports are intact, and the facade can be restored to its original grandeur." She pointed out details Marcus had missed, ornate stonework that could be cleaned and repaired, Original hardwood flooring that could be refinished. Architectural elements that spoke to the building's history as one of Seattle's premier cultural venues. "How much would something like this cost?" Marcus asked. "For a full restoration, maintaining historical accuracy while incorporating modern safety and accessibility features, probably $15 to $20 million. The number that would have been impossible just weeks earlier now seemed manageable, even reasonable. Marcus found himself imagining the space filled with people again, imagining Emma attending performances in a theater that bore their family name. "There's something else you should consider," Sarah continued. "A project like this would qualify for significant historic preservation tax credits. And if you structured it as a nonprofit cultural institution, there would be additional tax advantages, plus eligibility for grants and public funding." A nonprofit? Think about it. Your grandfather's collection could form the core of a permanent exhibition. The theater could host performances, educational programs, community events. You could create something that serves the public, while honoring both the building's history and your grandfather's wishes. The idea began to take shape in Marcus's mind. Not just a restored theater, but a cultural center that could provide scholarships for young artists, support for families dealing with medical crises, programs for children who needed creative outlets in their lives. Emma, who had been exploring the theater's damaged lobby while the adults talked, came running back with excitement. "Daddy, there's a room upstairs with stars painted on the ceiling. Can we fix it so the stars shine again?" Sarah smiled. "Those are probably part of the original design. With proper restoration, we can make them shine brighter than ever." As they drove home that afternoon, Emma peppered Marcus with questions about the theater renovation. Would there be a stage where she could perform? Could her friends come to see shows? Would they have a special room for the beautiful paintings? Marcus answered each question as thoughtfully as he could, but his mind was already racing ahead to the practical details of what such a project would involve. Permits, contractors, curators, program directors, board members, fundraising strategies. The scope was enormous. But for the first time since discovering the collection, Marcus felt like he had a clear sense of direction. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus sat at his kitchen table with his grandfather's journal open before him. He read through the entries again, paying particular attention to the passages where Joseph described his original vision for the Grand Meridian. "Art should not be hidden away in private collections," his grandfather had written. "It should live in the world, should speak to people, should remind them of beauty and possibility even in their darkest moments." Another entry, dated several years later, was even more specific. "I dream of a place where a child from any background can encounter greatness, where a parent struggling to make ends meet can find respite and inspiration, where artists can share their gifts with communities that need them most." Marcus closed the journal and looked around his small apartment. In a few months, if he chose, he could be living anywhere he wanted. But Emma was right to worry about leaving behind the people and places that mattered to them. Change didn't have to mean abandonment. He pulled out his laptop and began researching nonprofit organizations, cultural institutions, and historic preservation projects. He read about other individuals who had inherited significant collections and chosen to share them with the public. He studied the business models of successful community arts centers. By the time he finally went to bed, Marcus had filled several pages with notes and ideas. The project was ambitious, perhaps impossibly so, but it felt right in a way that simply selling the collection and moving to a bigger house did not. The next morning brought a phone call that complicated everything. Detective Ray Morrison from the Seattle Police Department's Art Theft Unit wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss the collection. "There's nothing to worry about, Mr. Chen," Detective Morrison assured him. "But when a collection of this value surfaces, especially one that's been out of sight for several decades, we're required to cross-reference it against databases of stolen or missing artwork." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "I have all the documentation showing legitimate purchase. I'm sure you do, and I'm sure everything will check out fine. This is just standard procedure. We'll meet with you and your attorney, review the provenance documents, and close the file. Should take a couple of hours at most." The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. Marcus spent the intervening days oscillating between confidence in his grandfather's documentation and anxiety about what the investigation might reveal. Margaret Hoffman remained optimistic, but she cautioned him that even legitimate collections sometimes contained pieces with complicated histories. Art that changed hands during World War II, for instance, can have ownership issues that persist decades later, even when the transactions were legal at the time they occurred, she explained. Your grandfather's collection spans several decades and includes works from European artists whose pieces were sometimes displaced during the war years. The uncertainty was maddening. Just when Marcus had begun to envision a clear path forward, this new complication arose to cloud everything again. He found himself snapping at Emma over small things, losing focus at work, lying awake at night staring at the ceiling. Emma, with the emotional intelligence that seemed to come naturally to her, noticed his distress. "Daddy, are you worried about something?" They were eating dinner, take-out Chinese food from the restaurant down the street, and Marcus realized he'd been pushing his lo mein around his plate without eating any of it. "A little bit, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-up things are complicated." "Is it about the paintings?" Marcus nodded. "Some people need to make sure that the paintings really belong to us, that Grandpa Joseph got them the right way." Emma considered this seriously. "But he did get them the right way, didn't he? You said he had papers that proved it." "Yes, he did. But sometimes, even when you have papers, people still want to double-check everything. Like when Mrs. Henderson checked my math homework even though I was sure I got all the answers right." "Exactly like that." Emma smiled. "And your answers were right, so everything turned out okay." Marcus felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "That's right. Everything turned out okay. So maybe everything will turn out okay with the paintings too." The simple logic was comforting, and Marcus found himself eating with better appetite than he'd had in days. Children, he reflected, had a way of cutting through complexity to reach essential truths. The Thursday meeting with Detective Morrison went better than Marcus had dared to hope. The detective was a soft-spoken man in his 40s, who clearly knew a great deal about art and art history. He reviewed each piece of documentation carefully, asked thoughtful questions about provenance, and cross-referenced several pieces against international databases of stolen artwork. "Everything checks out clean," he announced after 3 hours of meticulous review. "Your grandfather was remarkably thorough in his record-keeping. I wish all collectors were this careful about documentation." Margaret Hoffman smiled. "So there are no legal obstacles to Mr. Chen's ownership of the collection, none that I can see. As far as the Seattle Police Department is concerned, this case is closed." Detective Morrison shook Marcus's hand. "Congratulations, Mr. Chen. You've inherited something truly extraordinary." Walking out of the police station, Marcus felt lighter than he had in weeks. The last major uncertainty had been resolved. The collection was legally his, and he was free to decide how to use it. That evening, he called Sarah Kim to discuss moving forward with architectural plans for the theater renovation. He called Drive Vasquez to begin planning the first public exhibition of his grandfather's collection. He called several non-profit attorneys to discuss the legal structure for the cultural institution he was beginning to envision. Emma, sensing the change in his mood, was more animated than she'd been in days. She drew pictures of how she thought the theater should look when it was finished, complete with a stage for performances and special rooms for displaying the pretty paintings. "Can we have a party when it's all done?" she asked, as Marcus tucked her into bed. "Absolutely. The biggest party Seattle has ever seen. And can we invite everyone? Even Mrs. Patterson and Tony, and all my friends from school?" "Everyone," Marcus promised. That's exactly what Grandpa Joseph would have wanted. As Emma drifted off to sleep, Marcus stood in her doorway thinking about how much their lives had changed in just a few weeks. They were still living in the same small apartment, he was still working construction, Emma was still attending the same school. But everything felt different now, charged with possibility and purpose. The burned theater that had once seemed like a burden now represented hope. The hidden collection that had once seemed impossible now offered a path toward helping others. And most importantly, the future that had once seemed constrained by financial limitations now stretched out before them, vast and full of potential. Marcus Chen, construction worker turned accidental art curator, fell asleep that night dreaming of stars painted on theater ceilings and the sound of Emma's laughter echoing through restored halls. 2 years later, Marcus stood on the restored stage of the Grand Meridian Theater, watching as hundreds of people filled the elegant seats that had been painstakingly recreated to match the venue's original 1920s grandeur. The theater's reopening gala was everything he had dreamed it could be, but it was the smaller moments throughout the evening that truly moved him. Emma, now 10 years old and glowing with health thanks to the cutting-edge treatment her trust fund had made possible, served as one of the evening's junior ambassadors. She wore a midnight blue dress that made her look far more sophisticated than her years, and she moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had grown up watching her father transform an impossible dream into reality. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the acoustically perfect space. 2 years ago, this building was nothing but charred ruins and broken dreams. Tonight, it stands as proof that sometimes the most beautiful things rise from the ashes of what seemed lost forever. The audience applauded, but Marcus's attention was drawn to a section of reserved seats where some very special guests were seated. There was Mrs. Patterson, his former neighbor, who had watched Emma during countless evenings when Marcus was working on the renovation. Tony Rodriguez sat beside her, having left construction work to become the theater's facilities manager. Dr. Vasquez was there with her husband, beaming with pride at the successful authentication project that had launched her firm to international recognition. But it was the group of families in the front rows that made Marcus's throat tighten with emotion. These were the recipients of the Grand Meridian Foundation's first year of scholarships and medical assistance grants. Single parents who had been given the breathing room to pursue education while their children received quality care. Young artists who had been provided with the resources to develop their talents without worrying about rent or groceries. Families who had been facing impossible medical bills until the foundation stepped in to help. My grandfather, Joseph Chen, believed that art had the power to transform communities, Marcus continued. He believed that beauty and creativity shouldn't be luxuries reserved for the wealthy, but necessities available to everyone. Tonight, we're not just celebrating the restoration of a building, we're celebrating the restoration of hope. The first piece in the evening's program was a violin performance by 17-year-old Maria Santos, whose family had been struggling to afford her music lessons until the foundation provided a full scholarship. As her bow drew across the strings, filling the theater with soaring melody, Marcus remembered the conversation that had changed everything. It had been 6 months earlier, when the renovation was nearing completion, but Marcus was wrestling with doubts about the scope of his ambitions. Emma had found him in his temporary office, staring at financial projections that seemed to grow more complex by the day. "Daddy, why do you look worried? I thought we were happy about the theater." Marcus had pulled her onto his lap, trying to explain his concerns in terms she could understand. "I'm wondering if we're trying to do too much, too fast. Maybe we should have just fixed the building and displayed the paintings, instead of trying to start all these programs to help people." Emma had considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "But remember what you told me about Grandpa Joseph's letter? He wanted us to help families like ours used to be." "You're right, sweetheart, but helping people is harder than I thought it would be. There are so many rules and forms and people who have to approve everything." Emma had climbed down from his lap and walked to the window that overlooked the construction site. Workers were installing the restored marquee, and the theater's name was slowly taking shape in gleaming letters. "Daddy, do you remember when I was little and I couldn't breathe good, and you worked extra jobs to pay for my medicine even though you were tired?" Marcus had nodded, remembering those exhausting years when every month brought new financial challenges. "You didn't stop helping me because it was hard. You just kept going until I got better." Emma had turned back to him with absolute certainty in her young voice. "I think helping other people is like that too. It's hard, but you just keep going until they get better." The wisdom of his daughter had cut through all the complexity and doubt. The next morning, Marcus had called a meeting with his board of directors and announced that they would be expanding, not reducing, their outreach programs. Now, watching Maria Santos bring the audience to tears with her performance, Marcus knew that Emma had been right. The hard work had been worth it. After the violin piece, the evening's program continued with a short play performed by children from the Foundation's after-school drama program. The story they had chosen to perform was one Emma had written herself, about a princess who discovers that her true treasure isn't gold or jewels, but the friends she makes while helping others. Marcus watched from the wings as Emma took the stage to introduce the young actors, her voice clear and confident as she explained how the story had come to her. "I used to think being rich meant having lots of money," she said to the audience. But I learned that being rich really means having lots of ways to make other people happy. The play was a hit, especially with the younger audience members, but it was what happened during intermission that truly captured the spirit of the evening. Instead of the typical cocktail reception, the Grand Meridian had set up interactive art stations throughout the lobby, where professional artists worked alongside children and adults to create collaborative pieces that would become part of the theater's permanent collection. Marcus moved through the crowd, stopping to chat with guests and observe the creative energy that filled every corner of the space. At one station, a painter who had been supported by the Foundation's artist residency program was teaching a group of children how to blend colors. At another, a sculptor was helping teenagers create clay figures that would be fired and glazed for display in the theater's education wing. "This is incredible," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the director of Seattle Children's Hospital, who had become one of the Foundation's key partners. "I've never seen an event that brought together so many different parts of the community." Marcus smiled, watching as Emma helped a shy 6-year-old girl add handprints to a large canvas that would hang in the theater's main lobby. "My grandfather always said that art was meant to bring people together." I think he would have loved seeing this. The second half of the evening featured the formal unveiling of the Joseph Chen Memorial Gallery, where rotating selections from the collection would be displayed alongside educational materials that made the art accessible to visitors of all ages and backgrounds. The gallery's opening exhibition, curated by Dr. Vasquez, told the story of artistic movements across the 20th century, but it did so in a way that connected historical events to contemporary experiences. Each painting was accompanied not just by traditional museum labels, but by reflections from community members about what the work meant to them. A Picasso sketch was paired with thoughts from a local high school student about how art helped her process difficult emotions. A Monet landscape was accompanied by observations from an elderly man about how the painting reminded him of his childhood home in rural Washington. "Art isn't just something to look at," Marcus explained to the gathered crowd as they moved through the gallery. "It's something to experience, to connect with, to make part of your own story. These paintings have been hidden for 30 years, but tonight they begin a new chapter as part of our community's life." The centerpiece of the gallery was the small oil painting Marcus had noticed during his early visits to the basement, the one showing a man working with his hands. Research had revealed it to be a previously unknown work by Edward Hopper, depicting a craftsman absorbed in his labor. The painting had been positioned so that visitors would encounter it near the end of their gallery tour, and Marcus had insisted on writing the interpretive text himself. "This painting speaks to me," his label read, "because it honors the dignity of work and the beauty that can be found in ordinary moments. My grandfather saw something in this piece that connected to his own experience. As someone who built something meaningful with his hands and his heart, I hope that everyone who sees it will be reminded that their own work, whatever it might be, has value and purpose." As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself in conversation with Rebecca Martinez, a journalist from the Seattle Times who had been covering the theater's restoration since the beginning. She had requested an interview for a feature story about the project's impact on the community. "When you first discovered the collection," she asked, "did you ever imagine it would lead to something like this?" Marcus looked around the bustling theater, where guests were reluctant to leave despite the late hour. Children were still working on art projects. Adults were exchanging contact information to collaborate on future initiatives, and Emma was holding court near the stage, telling a group of younger children about her plans for next year's programs. "Honestly, my first thought was just about paying for Emma's medical treatments," he admitted. "I couldn't see past our immediate needs. But I think that's how most good things start, with someone trying to solve a problem right in front of them, and then discovering that the solution can help other people too." "What do you think your grandfather would say if he could see this?" Marcus considered the question carefully. Over the past 2 years, as he had immersed himself in Joseph's journals and spoken with people who had known him during his gallery days, he had developed a clearer picture of the man who had left him such an extraordinary legacy. "I think he would be amazed by the community response," Marcus said finally. His original gallery was more traditional, more focused on collectors and serious art lovers. This place is messier, louder, more democratic. But I think he would love that. His journals talked about wanting art to be part of people's daily lives, not something separate from ordinary experience. Rebecca scribbled notes as Marcus continued. "You know, I used to feel guilty about inheriting something I didn't earn, but I've come to understand that the real inheritance wasn't the money, or even the art. It was the responsibility to use what I'd been given in a way that honored both the past and the future." And what does the future hold for the Grand Meridian? Marcus glanced toward Emma, who was now helping to clean up art supplies with the easy helpfulness that had become second nature to her. We're planning to expand the education programs, maybe add a music school component. Emma has some ideas about a summer camp for kids who are dealing with medical challenges, and we're working with other organizations to replicate this model in different cities. So this is just the beginning? I hope so. The collection is large enough to support multiple institutions, and there are a lot of communities that could benefit from what we've learned here. Marcus paused, then added with a smile. Emma keeps reminding me that we have a responsibility to share what we've been given. She's pretty wise for a 10-year-old. As the last guests finally departed, Marcus and Emma stood alone on the stage, looking out at the empty seats that would be filled again tomorrow night with a different audience for a different program. The theater had bookings solid for the next 18 months, with a waiting list of artists, performers, and community groups hoping to use the space. "Daddy, are you happy?" Emma asked, taking his hand as they had done so many times over the years. Marcus squeezed her fingers gently. "I'm more than happy, sweetheart. I'm proud. Proud of what we've built. Proud of the people we've been able to help, and especially proud of you." Emma leaned against his side, and they stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then she said, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" "Do you think maybe we were supposed to find those paintings? Like, maybe it wasn't really an accident that Grandpa Joseph left them to us?" Marcus had wondered the same thing many times over the past 2 years. The timing of the inheritance, coming just when Emma's medical needs were becoming more expensive and his own resources were nearly exhausted, had seemed almost miraculous. But beyond the financial rescue, there had been something deeper at work, a sense of purpose and direction that had transformed not just their circumstances, but their understanding of what their lives could mean. "I think," Marcus said carefully, "that sometimes the best things happen when we're not looking for them. But once they happen, it's up to us to decide what to do with them." Emma nodded sagely. "Like finding a treasure, but then you have to choose whether to keep it hidden or share it with everyone." Exactly like that. They made their way through the theater, turning off lights and checking that everything was secure for the night. As they walked, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The burned building that had seemed like a burden had become a beacon. The hidden collection that had seemed too good to be true had become the foundation for something larger than he had ever imagined possible. But perhaps most importantly, the scared single father who had once worried about making rent had discovered that he was capable of much more than he had ever believed. Not because the money had changed who he was, but because the responsibility had revealed who he had always been underneath the exhaustion and anxiety. Outside the theater, Emma paused to look up at the restored marquee, which displayed the message Grand Meridian Theater, where dreams take flight. The words had been her suggestion, chosen after much deliberation from dozens of possibilities submitted by community members. "Daddy, do you think other people will find treasures like we did?" Marcus considered this as he helped her into their car. Not the luxury vehicle he could now afford, but the reliable sedan that suited their practical needs. Maybe not the same kind of treasure, but I think everyone has something valuable they can share with the world. They just have to figure out what it is. As they drove through the quiet Seattle streets toward their new home, a comfortable house in the same neighborhood where Emma had grown up, close to the friends and places that mattered to them, Marcus reflected on how different this drive felt from the one they had taken 2 years earlier, when they first discovered the basement chambers. Then, he had been overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had found, and uncertain about what it meant for their future. Now, he felt grounded in purpose and clear about the path ahead. The uncertainty hadn't disappeared entirely. Running a major cultural institution came with daily challenges and difficult decisions, but it was the kind of uncertainty that came with growth rather than fear. Emma fell asleep in the back seat during the drive home, exhausted by the excitement of the evening, but peaceful in the way that children sleep when they feel completely secure. As Marcus carried her into the house and tucked her into bed, he thought about the conversations they would have in the years to come as she grew older, and began to understand more fully the responsibility she would one day inherit. The Grand Meridian Foundation was structured to continue its work for generations, with Emma serving as its eventual director if she chose to accept that role. But Marcus was determined that the choice would truly be hers, made from a position of strength and understanding rather than obligation. For now, though, she was still a child who loved art projects and helping others, who saw the world with optimism and clarity, who believed that treasures were meant to be shared. As Marcus turned off her bedroom light, Emma stirred just enough to whisper, "Daddy, tonight was the best night ever." Marcus smiled in the darkness. "Yes, sweetheart. It really was." Later that night, unable to sleep despite his exhaustion, Marcus found himself in his study, looking through a photo album, documenting the theater's transformation. The pictures told an incredible story, from the burned-out shell they had inherited to the vibrant cultural center that had hosted its first major event just hours earlier. But the images that moved him most weren't the before and after shots of the building itself. They were the pictures of people. Children laughing during art classes, teenagers performing in plays they had written themselves, adults learning new skills in workshops, families attending performances they never could have afforded before the Foundation's outreach programs began. On his desk was a letter that had arrived just that morning from a single mother named Lisa, whose son had been struggling in school until he enrolled in the theater's tutoring program. "Before we found the Grand Meridian," she had written, "I felt like we were invisible, like the world didn't have room for families like ours. Now my son talks about becoming an artist, and I'm taking classes to become a teacher. You didn't just restore a building. You restored our hope." Marcus set the letter aside and opened his laptop, where he had been working on his own journal entries, documenting the lessons learned during the theater's first 2 years of operation. He wanted to leave a record for Emma and for future directors of the Foundation, a guide to the principles that had made their work successful. "The most important thing we learned," he wrote, "is that helping people isn't about having all the answers or unlimited resources. It's about creating spaces where people can discover their own answers and develop their own resources." The art collection opened doors, but it was the community that walked through them. He paused, thinking about his grandfather's journals and the wisdom they had contained. Joseph Chun had understood something fundamental about the relationship between individual gifts and collective responsibility, something that had taken Marcus years to fully grasp. "True wealth," Marcus continued typing, "isn't about accumulating things for yourself. It's about using whatever you have, money, skills, time, connections, to create opportunities for others. The paintings in our basement were valuable, but they only became truly precious when they started changing lives." As he wrote, Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation he and Emma had shared earlier that evening, about whether their discovery had been accidental or destined. He had avoided giving her a definitive answer because he wasn't entirely sure himself. But sitting in his quiet study, surrounded by evidence of what they had accomplished together, Marcus began to understand that the question itself might be less important than he had thought. Whether their inheritance had been luck or fate, accident or design, what mattered was what they had chosen to do with it. The burned theater could have remained a ruin. The hidden collection could have been sold to private collectors and scattered around the world. The money could have been spent on personal luxuries and comfortable isolation. Instead, they had chosen to build something that served others, something that honored both the past and the future, something that recognized the inherent dignity and potential in every person who walked through their doors. As Marcus finally closed his laptop and prepared for bed, he thought about the question Emma had asked earlier, whether other people would find treasures like theirs. The answer, he realized, was that they already had. Every day, in ways both large and small, people discovered gifts they hadn't known they possessed, opportunities they hadn't expected to receive, chances to make a difference they hadn't thought possible. The real treasure wasn't the collection in the basement or the restored theater, or even the Foundation's programs. It was the understanding that everyone carried something valuable within themselves, something that could be shared with others, something that could transform ordinary moments into extraordinary ones. Marcus Chen fell asleep that night not as an accidental millionaire or an unlikely philanthropist, but as a father who had learned to see possibility where others saw only problems, hope where others saw only challenges, and treasure where others saw only responsibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to choose between keeping treasures hidden and sharing them with the world. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus slept without worry, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of work well done and dreams fulfilled. The Grand Meridian Theater stood in the Seattle darkness, its restored facade glowing softly in the streetlights, ready for whatever stories the next day would bring. Inside, in frames and cases, and on stages and walls, art waited to inspire new generations of dreamers, creators, and believers in the power of beauty to transform lives. And in a comfortable house not far away, a 10-year-old girl slept peacefully, dreaming of all the ways she would continue sharing the treasure that had found its way to them, one burned building and one basement chamber at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.